I just went through probably every single metabolic study on aging and fat loss over the past decade, and I've got to tell you, most people over 40 are completely missing what's actually happening inside their bodies. So in this video, we're going to cover several critical things. First, we're going to talk about why the metabolism after 40 isn't actually slowing down the way you think it is. Then we're going to talk about the single most overlooked factor that's driving fat storage in people over 40. And it has nothing to do with exercise. We're going to talk about why muscle loss is only part of the equation. We're going to discuss what's happening at the cellular level that makes traditional diet advice basically useless after a certain age. We're going to talk about the specific hormone that nobody's addressing properly. And finally, we're going to talk about how to reverse this process starting literally today. So this is comprehensive, but I've made it practical, digestible, and most importantly, actionable. So let's start with probably the biggest misconception that I see everywhere. Your metabolism isn't actually crashing after 40. There was a groundbreaking study published in Science that analyzed metabolic data from over 6,600 people ranging from infancy to age 95. And what they found completely contradicts what we've been told for decades. Metabolic rate doesn't actually decline in your 30s or 40s. It stays remarkably stable from age 20 all the way to age 60. After 60, it only declines by about 0.7% per year. So if your metabolism was truly stable until 60, why does everyone gain weight after 40? This is the question that matters, and the answer isn't what you think. The real issue isn't that your metabolism is slowing down. The real issue is that your cells are becoming resistant to the signals that tell them to burn fat. This is called metabolic inflexibility. And it's probably the most important concept that nobody's talking about when it comes to fat loss after 40. Metabolic flexibility is your body's ability to switch between burning carbohydrates and burning fat depending on what's available. When you're young, this switch flips easily. You eat carbs, you burn carbs. You fast, you burn fat, it's seamless. But after 40, something changes. The mitochondria, which are the energy factories in your cells, they start to become less efficient. They don't switch fuels as easily. And when that happens, your body defaults to storing fat instead of burning it, even when you're doing everything right with diet and exercise. There was a study in Cell Metabolism that looked at this exact phenomenon. They took muscle biopsies from younger adults and older adults and measured their mitochondrial function. What they found was striking. The mitochondria in older adults were significantly less responsive to insulin. They were less able to increase fat oxidation when needed, and they showed higher levels of what's called incomplete fat oxidation, which means fat was being partially broken down but not fully burned. This creates metabolic byproducts that actually make insulin resistance worse. It's a vicious cycle. So what's causing this mitochondrial dysfunction? This is where it gets really interesting because the answer isn't age itself. The answer is something called NAD decline. NAD stands for nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. It's a coenzyme that exists in every single cell in your body, and it's absolutely critical for mitochondrial function. NAD is what allows your mitochondria to convert food into energy. Without adequate NAD, your mitochondria can't function properly. They can't burn fat efficiently. They can't respond to insulin correctly. And here's the kicker. NAD levels decline by about 50% between age 40 and age 60. This isn't a small drop. This is a massive decline that fundamentally changes how your cells produce and use energy. There was a study published in Cell that showed that boosting NAD levels in older mice completely restored their mitochondrial function to levels seen in young mice. Their exercise capacity improved, their insulin sensitivity improved, and they lost fat even without changes to diet or exercise. This tells us something incredibly important. The fat gain after 40 isn't inevitable. It's driven by a specific biochemical change that can be addressed. Now, before we go further, I want to talk about how you actually boost NAD because this is practical and this matters. There are several ways to increase NAD levels naturally. The most researched approach is through NAD precursors. These are compounds that your body converts into NAD. The two main ones are nicotinamide riboside, which is called NR, and nicotinamide mononucleotide, which is NMN. Both of these have been shown in human studies to significantly increase NAD levels. There was a study in Nature Communications that gave NR to middle-aged adults for 6 weeks. NAD levels increased by 60%, insulin sensitivity improved, and markers of mitochondrial function significantly increased. Another study in Science found that NMN improved glucose metabolism and increased physical activity in older mice. And there's emerging human data showing similar benefits. But here's what's really important. NAD boosting only works if you're also doing the other things that support mitochondrial function. You can't just take a supplement and expect everything to fix itself. You need to create the right environment. That environment starts with something that most people completely overlook, and that's meal timing. Not what you eat, but when you eat. Because it turns out that after 40, when you eat might be more important than what you eat. There was a study published in Cell Metabolism that looked at time-restricted eating in middle-aged adults. Participants ate all their food within an 8 to 10 hour window each day. They didn't change what they ate or how much they ate. They just changed when they ate. After 12 weeks, they lost an average of 3% of their body weight, but more importantly, they lost visceral fat. Their insulin sensitivity improved, their blood pressure dropped, and their inflammatory markers decreased significantly, all without calorie restriction, all without exercise changes. Just meal timing. This works because of something called circadian biology. Your body has an internal clock that regulates metabolism, and this clock controls when your cells are most efficient at burning fat versus storing it. In the morning, your cells are primed to burn fuel. Insulin sensitivity is highest. Fat oxidation is most efficient. But as the day goes on, this changes. By evening, your cells become more resistant to insulin. They're more likely to store calories as fat, and they're less efficient at burning what you eat. This pattern becomes much more pronounced after age 40. There was a study in diabetes care that compared the same meal eaten at breakfast versus dinner in older adults. When eaten at breakfast, the meal resulted in lower blood sugar, lower insulin, and higher fat oxidation. When eaten at dinner, the exact same meal caused higher blood sugar, higher insulin, and almost no fat oxidation. Same food, same calories, completely different metabolic response. This tells us that timing isn't just about convenience. It's about working with your biology instead of against it. And for people over 40, this becomes critical because the circadian system becomes less robust with age. The signals get weaker, the rhythms get disrupted. And when that happens, your metabolism becomes sluggish. So meal timing isn't a diet hack. It's a way to restore proper circadian function. It's a way to tell your cells when to burn and when to rest. And the research shows that this alone can drive significant fat loss, even without other changes. But there's another piece to this that's equally important, and that's protein distribution. Most people over 40 are eating protein completely wrong. They're not eating enough total protein, and they're definitely not eating it at the right times. There was a study in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition that looked at protein intake patterns in older adults. They found that most people eat very little protein at breakfast, moderate protein at lunch, and a huge amount at dinner. This is the worst possible pattern for muscle maintenance and fat loss after 40. Here's why. Muscle protein synthesis, which is the process of building and maintaining muscle, requires a threshold amount of protein to be activated. For older adults, that threshold is about 30 to 40 grams of high-quality protein per meal. If you're eating 10 grams at breakfast, 20 grams at lunch, and 60 grams at dinner, you're only triggering muscle protein synthesis once per day. You're wasting the opportunity at breakfast and lunch, and you can't make up for it at dinner because there's a ceiling to how much protein your muscles can use at one time. Anything beyond that threshold doesn't provide additional benefit. It just gets oxidized for energy or converted to glucose. The research shows that distributing protein evenly across meals, especially prioritizing it at breakfast, significantly improves muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. And this matters for fat loss because muscle is metabolically active tissue. The more muscle you maintain, the higher your resting metabolic rate, the better your insulin sensitivity, and the more efficient your fat oxidation. There was a study in nutrients that had older adults eat 30 grams of protein at each meal versus their usual pattern. After 12 weeks, the evenly distributed protein group gained more muscle mass and lost more fat, even though total protein intake was the same. This is huge because it tells us that it's not just about hitting a protein target. It's about how you distribute it. And for people over 40, front-loading protein at breakfast might be one of the most powerful strategies for maintaining muscle and losing fat. I personally aim for at least 40 grams of protein within an hour of waking up. Usually eggs, usually some kind of meat, and often a protein shake on top of that. And I'm very particular about the quality of that protein, because after 40, quality matters even more than quantity. This brings me to something I've been really focused on lately, and that's protein purity. Most protein powders are contaminated with heavy metals. There was an analysis by the Clean Label Project that tested over 130 protein powders. They found that over 70% contained detectable levels of lead. Over 50% contained BPA, and many contained arsenic, mercury, and cadmium. These aren't trace amounts, these are levels that exceed California Prop 65 limits, which are pretty strict. This matters because heavy metal exposure disrupts mitochondrial function, it impairs thyroid function, and it directly interferes with fat metabolism. So if you're over 40 and you're trying to optimize your metabolism, consuming contaminated protein is literally working against you. That's why I switched to Puri. It's one of the only brands that third-party tests every single batch for over 200 contaminants and publishes the results online. You can scan the QR code on the bag and see the actual test results for your specific batch. It's transparent, it's clean, and the quality is exceptional. Their grass-fed whey is made with just a few ingredients. Their vanilla uses real bourbon vanilla from Madagascar. It's legit. So if you're serious about optimizing your metabolism after 40, clean protein matters. That link is down below. Use code THOMAS at puri.com Thomas, and you get 32% off when you start a subscription. Now let's talk about the hormone that nobody's addressing properly, and that's cortisol. Everyone talks about testosterone and estrogen when it comes to aging and fat loss. But cortisol is probably more important, and it's definitely more overlooked. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone. It's released in response to physical stress, mental stress, and metabolic stress. In the short term, cortisol is helpful. It mobilizes energy, it increases alertness, it helps you respond to challenges. But chronic elevation of cortisol is devastating for fat loss, especially after 40. Here's why. Cortisol directly promotes visceral fat accumulation. It does this by increasing the activity of an enzyme called 11-beta-hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase type 1. This enzyme converts inactive cortisone into active cortisol, specifically in abdominal fat tissue. So even if your systemic cortisol levels aren't that high, the cortisol concentration in your belly fat can be extremely high. And this creates a local environment that promotes fat storage and inhibits fat breakdown. There was a study in psychosomatic medicine that measured cortisol levels and fat distribution in middle-aged women. They found that women with higher cortisol reactivity to stress had significantly more visceral fat even after controlling for total body weight and diet. This wasn't about eating more. This was about how their bodies responded to stress. Another study in obesity found that chronic stress increased cortisol and directly predicted weight gain over a 9-year period. And the weight that was gained was predominantly abdominal fat. This tells us that stress management isn't just about feeling better. It's about controlling the hormonal environment that determines where fat is stored. And after 40, this becomes even more critical because cortisol regulation becomes less efficient with age. The circadian rhythm of cortisol, which normally peaks in the morning and declines throughout the day, becomes flatter. This means cortisol stays elevated longer. It doesn't drop as much at night. And this chronic elevation drives fat storage, disrupts sleep, and impairs recovery. So what do you do about this? The research is actually pretty clear. The most effective interventions for lowering cortisol aren't supplements. They're behavioral. There was a meta-analysis in Health Psychology Review that looked at different stress reduction techniques. They found that mindfulness-based interventions, which include meditation and breathwork, significantly reduced cortisol levels. Another study found that just 10 minutes of deep breathing per day lowered cortisol by 25% after 4 weeks. That's massive. And it's free. It requires no equipment. It's just breathing. I know this sounds too simple, but the data is really clear. Controlled breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It signals to your body that you're safe, and when your body feels safe, cortisol drops. Fat storage decreases, and fat oxidation increases. I personally do 10 minutes of box breathing every morning. It's 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out, 4 seconds hold. Repeat. It's simple, but it's effective. And for people over 40 dealing with chronic stress, this might be more important than any diet or exercise change. Now let's talk about sleep, because this is where everything we've talked about either works or falls apart. Sleep is when your body repairs mitochondria. It's when growth hormone is released. It's when cortisol is supposed to drop. And it's when your cells restore insulin sensitivity. If sleep is disrupted, none of the other strategies we've talked about will work as well as they should. There was a study in Annals of Internal Medicine that put healthy adults on a calorie-restricted diet. One group slept 8.5 hours per night. The other group slept 5.5 hours per night. Both groups lost the same amount of weight, but the composition of that weight loss was completely different. The group that slept 8.5 hours lost mostly fat. The group that slept 5.5 hours lost mostly muscle. Same calories, same diet, completely different outcome. This tells us that sleep isn't just about recovery. It's about what your body chooses to burn. And after 40, sleep quality declines. Deep sleep decreases, sleep fragmentation increases. And this directly impacts fat loss. There was another study in PLOS Medicine that followed over 1,000 adults and measured their sleep duration and body composition over 5 years. They found that people who slept less than 6 hours per night gained significantly more visceral fat compared to those who slept 7 to 8 hours. And this was independent of diet and exercise. Sleep deprivation increases ghrelin, which is your hunger hormone. It decreases leptin, which is your satiety hormone. It increases cortisol, and it impairs glucose metabolism. All of these changes promote fat storage, especially in the abdomen. So if you're over 40 and you're not prioritizing sleep, you're fighting an uphill battle. I know life gets busy. I know sleep can be hard to control, but this is non-negotiable if you want to lose fat and keep it off. Aim for 7 to 8 hours. Make your room dark. Keep it cool. Avoid screens before bed. These aren't just sleep hygiene tips. These are metabolic interventions. Now let's talk about something that might surprise you, and that's cold exposure. Cold exposure has become really popular in the biohacking community, but most people don't understand why it works or how to use it properly. Cold exposure activates brown adipose tissue, which is a special type of fat that burns calories to generate heat. Unlike white fat, which stores energy, brown fat burns energy. And the more active your brown fat is, the higher your metabolic rate. There was a study in Cell Metabolism that exposed participants to mild cold for 2 hours per day for 6 weeks. They found that cold exposure increased brown fat activity by 45%. Resting metabolic rate increased, and glucose uptake improved. Another study found that regular cold exposure improved insulin sensitivity and reduced visceral fat in overweight adults. This works because cold stress activates the sympathetic nervous system. It increases norepinephrine. And norepinephrine directly stimulates brown fat and promotes fat breakdown in white fat. But here's the catch. Cold exposure only works if it's done consistently and at the right intensity. You don't need ice baths. You don't need extreme cold. You just need consistent mild cold exposure. There was a study that found that simply lowering room temperature to 66 degrees Fahrenheit for several hours per day was enough to activate brown fat and increase energy expenditure. That's not extreme. That's just turning down the thermostat. I personally do cold showers every morning for about 3 minutes. It's uncomfortable, but it's manageable. And the metabolic benefits are real. For people over 40, cold exposure can be a powerful tool to increase metabolic rate without exercise. But it has to be consistent. It has to be part of your routine. And it works best when combined with everything else we've talked about. Now let's connect all of this together, because this is where it becomes practical. The hidden fat-burning tactic for people over 40 isn't a single thing. It's a system. It's about restoring metabolic flexibility by addressing the root causes of metabolic decline. First, you boost NAD to restore mitochondrial function. Second, you use meal timing to work with your circadian biology. Third, you distribute protein properly to maintain muscle and support metabolism. Fourth, you manage cortisol through stress reduction techniques. Fifth, you prioritize sleep to optimize hormone balance and recovery. And sixth, you use cold exposure to activate brown fat and increase metabolic rate. None of these things require intense exercise, none of them require extreme diets. But together, they create an environment where your cells can burn fat efficiently again. There was a study in Aging Cell that looked at a multi-component intervention similar to what I just described. They had middle-aged adults follow a program that included NAD supplementation, time-restricted eating, high-protein breakfast, stress management, and sleep optimization. After 12 weeks, participants lost an average of 8 pounds of fat, but more importantly, their metabolic flexibility improved dramatically. Their ability to switch between burning carbs and burning fat was restored to levels seen in younger adults. Their insulin sensitivity improved. Their inflammatory markers dropped, and their energy levels increased significantly. This tells us that metabolic decline after 40 isn't permanent, it's reversible. But it requires a comprehensive approach. You can't just fix one thing and expect everything to change. You have to address the system, and this is where most people go wrong. They focus on exercise because that's what they've been told matters most. But exercise without metabolic flexibility is like trying to drive a car with the parking brake on. You're working hard, but you're not getting anywhere. The research shows that metabolic flexibility is the foundation. Once that's restored, exercise becomes incredibly effective. But if you try to exercise your way out of metabolic inflexibility, you'll just end up frustrated and burnt out. So start with the foundation, restore your mitochondria, fix your meal timing, optimize your protein, manage your stress, prioritize your sleep, use cold exposure strategically, and then add exercise on top of that. That's when everything clicks. That's when fat loss becomes effortless, and that's when you stop fighting your body and start working with it. If this approach is new to you, I've done other videos that go deeper into each of these topics. There's one on NAD and mitochondrial function, there's one on meal timing and circadian biology, there's one on protein distribution for muscle maintenance. All of these are linked below. They're practical, they're science-based, and they're designed to help you implement this system step by step. So check those out, and as always, keep it locked in here. I'll see you tomorrow.